In February 1942, the Luftwaffe achieved what seemed impossible, supplying 100,000 encircled troops by air alone. This success would kill 300,000 men at Stalingrad. The story of Demyansk reveals one of history's cruelest paradoxes, a victory so narrow it should have served as a warning, but instead became a blueprint for catastrophe. What happened in the frozen forests south of Leningrad was not the triumph Nazi propaganda claimed. It was a fragile experiment that barely worked under ideal conditions, then was fatally misread by Hitler and Hermann Göring as proof that armies could survive encirclement indefinitely. The airbridge that strained to feed 100,000 men over 70 kilometers would be asked to perform a miracle 3 times larger at Stalingrad. The men who froze and starved at Demyansk bought their freedom with a lesson no one would learn. The trap closed on February 8, 1942, sealing 100,000 German soldiers in a frozen pocket that should have meant surrender or death. Soviet forces had been hammering at German Army Group North since their victory at Moscow, launching a broad winter counteroffensive to shatter the siege of Leningrad. General Pavel Kurochkin's northwestern front targeted the critical Staraya Russa Railway, the lifeline connecting German forces to their supply bases. Through dense forests and waist-deep snow, the 1st and 11th Shock armies drove forward, suffering enormous casualties, but never stopping. When the Soviet pincers met, they trapped 6 German divisions in a pocket centered on the town of Demyansk. Among the encircled were the SS Totenkopf Division, formed from concentration camp guards and known for fanatical resistance. These men suddenly faced annihilation. The pocket stretched across 1,200 square kilometers of frozen hell, cut off from German lines, surrounded by an enemy that had committed 400,000 troops to crush them. Temperatures plunged to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Without resupply, starvation would kill them in weeks. The logical response was immediate breakout or retreat. Instead, Hitler decided to use the pocket as a test case for a dangerous theory that the Luftwaffe could keep an entire army alive from the sky alone. The conditions appeared uniquely favorable. The distance to German-held airfields at Staraya Russa was only 60 to 70 kilometers, a short hop by Eastern Front standards. The encircled force, while large, was manageable. Soviet air defenses in the region were limited. If aerial resupply could work anywhere, it could work here. But could the Luftwaffe actually keep 100,000 men alive from the sky alone? The air bridge became a lifeline, but one that was always fraying and sustained only by unrepeatable luck. The Luftwaffe assembled nearly 200 Ju-52 transport aircraft and He-111 bombers converted for cargo duty. These planes flew constant missions into 2 makeshift airstrips, Demyansk and Pesky, both frequently under artillery fire, muddy or snowbound. Transport crews called the Ju-52s our angels and listened desperately for their engines. Those engines brought life, but they never brought enough. General Walter von Brockdorff-Ahlefeldt, commanding the trapped 2nd Army Corps, calculated his men needed 270 tons of supplies daily. The Luftwaffe often delivered less than 200. Even in the operation's successful phases, chronic undersupply was the reality. German soldiers wrote letters home describing snow red with blood and black with frostbite. Men boiled leather belts for something to chew. Horse meat became a luxury. Medical supplies ran so low that doctors amputated frostbitten limbs with inadequate anesthesia. The airlift was not sustaining an army. It was keeping men alive just barely enough to continue dying slowly. The cost to the Luftwaffe was devastating. Over the course of the operation, 265 aircraft were destroyed, shot down by fighters, torn apart by flak, or wrecked in landing accidents. Pilots described landing at night on narrow runways lit by burning barrels, sliding on ice while shells exploded nearby. On return flights, they evacuated the wounded, describing limbs frozen black and the stench of gangrene filling the fuselage. This was the miracle of Demyansk, a meat grinder operating at the absolute edge of collapse. The operation succeeded only because of advantages that masked its fundamental fragility. The 70-kilometer flight distance was critical any longer, and the Luftwaffe could not have sustained even inadequate delivery rates. Soviet air opposition was limited compared to what would come later. The pocket was large enough to defend, but small enough to supply. Even then, the Germans inside were starving. The SS Totenkopf division held positions through savage close-quarters combat, often fighting hand-to-hand and freezing to death in the same night. The Soviets suffered catastrophically, over 70,000 casualties versus only 3,000 German deaths. This made the defense appear more successful than the logistics revealed. When relief forces finally broke through on April 22, 1942, Hitler saw proof of a miracle. His generals saw a warning no one would heed. Victory has a dangerous way of erasing the memory of how close it came to disaster. When relief forces reached Demyansk, Hitler seized on the outcome as validation of his stand-fast doctrine. To him, this proved that willpower and air supply could overcome encirclement. He chose not to see how barely the operation had succeeded. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, promised Hitler that the Air Force could replicate Demyansk's supply miracle anywhere. Göring needed a victory to restore his reputation, and Demyansk gave him one. He presented it as a demonstration that German air power could sustain encircled armies indefinitely. Internal Luftwaffe reports knew otherwise. They had seen the losses and exhaustion. But Göring made his promises anyway. General Kurt Zeitzler and other commanders warned that Demyansk's model could not be replicated. They argued that in different conditions, greater distances, larger forces, stronger enemy defenses, the airbridge would collapse. Hitler dismissed these warnings, citing Demyansk as proof that encircled armies could survive if they held their ground. The barely sustained operation became Nazi propaganda, a case study in self-deception where the memory of freezing men eating horses was replaced by tales of heroic resistance. What should have taught the severe limitations of aerial resupply became validation for refusing breakout orders in future encirclements. The lesson learned was exactly wrong. Demyansk had shown that even under ideal conditions, an airbridge could barely sustain a force. Instead, Hitler concluded that air supply was a proven solution. 9 months later, that misreading would face its ultimate test. When 300,000 men were trapped at Stalingrad in November 1942, Hitler had his answer ready. We did it at Demyansk. The 6th Army, vastly larger than the Demyansk force, was encircled in a pocket, requiring vastly more supplies. The mathematics were brutal. Demyansk required 270 tons daily for 100,000 men, over 70 kilometers. Stalingrad required nearly 800 tons daily for 300,000 men, over 200 kilometers. The distance was quadruple. The supply requirement was triple. The force was 3 times larger. Hitler cited Demyansk repeatedly during Stalingrad decision-making. Göring, seeking to repeat his earlier triumph, again promised the Luftwaffe could supply the pocket, despite knowing the scale was impossible. General Seitzler warned that Soviet air defenses had grown vastly stronger and the winter conditions were harsher. The Luftwaffe was more stretched, its fleet depleted. Hitler dismissed every warning. He believed willpower and air supply could overcome any obstacle. The fact that Demyansk had barely worked, that soldiers had starved even with the airlift functioning, did not penetrate his obsession. The airlift that never worked adequately at Demyansk would now be asked to perform a miracle 3 times larger. The result was predictable. The Luftwaffe could not deliver even a fraction of required supplies to Stalingrad. The 6th Army starved, froze, and was annihilated. Over 300,000 men were killed or captured because Hitler believed the lesson of Demyansk was that encircled armies could survive. The real lesson, that aerial resupply was fragile and limited, was never learned. Sometimes the most dangerous victories are the ones that succeed just barely enough to be believed. Demyansk's success was built on chronic undersupply and massive losses. Yet, the airlift became propaganda proof that encircled armies could survive indefinitely. The memory of its fragility was erased. Official narratives emphasized heroism, not starvation. The operation became a training case study, cited as evidence of what German willpower could achieve. Hitler's obsessive citation of Demyansk during Stalingrad directly linked the 2 battles. One near disaster became the justification for catastrophe. What killed the men at Stalingrad was not just logistics failure, it was the dangerous illusion of success created by misreading Demyansk. The paradox was complete. Demyansk succeeded just enough to become fatal. The survivors of Demyansk, evacuated when the Germans finally abandoned the pocket in 1943, carried the scars for life. Frostbite left men without limbs. Psychological trauma haunted those who had lived through months of encirclement. These men were living evidence of the operation's true cost, but their suffering was packaged as triumph. In the end, Demyansk's greatest danger was not its failure, but its success. Just sufficient to be believed, just convincing enough to kill on a far greater scale. The story reveals how a barely sustained airlift under ideal conditions became a deadly illusion. Hitler and Göring fatally misread marginal success as proof that encircled armies could survive by air alone. What should have been a warning became the blueprint for abandoning the 6th Army at Stalingrad. Demyansk saved 100,000 men. Its memory condemned 300,000 more. The frozen pocket south of Leningrad became a case study in how success can be more dangerous than failure when the lessons are willfully misread. The Luftwaffe crews who flew through flak, the soldiers who ate leather, they survived a trial that should never have been repeated. Instead, their survival became the justification for Stalingrad. The paradox of Demyansk is that it succeeded just enough to kill on a scale far beyond its own suffering. In the calculus of catastrophe, sometimes a narrow escape is the most dangerous outcome of all. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.